Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you
Good morning. Welcome to the American Culturist, the show where we unapologetically celebrate the greatest civilization the world has ever known, the one built on Enlightenment reason, individual liberty, Christian moral foundations, and the conservative conviction that some cultures are simply superior to others because they value truth, beauty, and human flourishing over fanaticism and submission. Now, if you've been paying any attention at all these past few months, you know the left has spent decades turning our national institutions into guilt factories, museums that lecture instead of inspire, performing arts centers that push ideology instead of excellence, and taxpayer funded grants that reward self loathing over American greatness. But that era is ending, and it's ending with a bang. Today, we're doing a deep dive on President Trump's quiet but relentless culture war offensive to reclaim the Smithsonian, the Kennedy Center, and public arts funding for the purpose they were always meant to serve, celebrating the extraordinary achievements of the American people instead of obsessing over every flaw in our past. This isn't censorship, this is correction, and the left has been losing their mind over it. Stick with me because by the end of this episode, you're going to see exactly why these moves aren't just smart politics, they're a moral imperative for the survival of Western civilization itself. Now let's get to the meat of it because this isn't some vague culture war tweet storm. This is President Trump wielding the actual levers of executive power to take back the institutions that shape how every young American learns who we are. And he's doing it with precision, with legal authority, and with zero apology. It all started on March 27th, 2025, when President Trump sat down and signed Executive Order 14253. Here's what it actually means, not what the media twisted it into. The order declares it official policy of the United States government to restore every federal history site, park, and museum, explicitly naming the Smithsonian to restore federal sites dedicated to history, including parks and museums, to solemn and uplifting public monuments that remind Americans of our extraordinary heritage, consistent progress towards becoming a more perfect union, an unmatched record of advancing liberty, prosperity, and human flourishing. Museums in our nation's capital should be places where individuals go to learn, not to be subjected to ideological indoctrination or divisive narratives that distort our shared history. It calls out the Smithsonian by name, stating, once widely respected as a symbol of American excellence and a global icon of cultural achievement, the Smithsonian Institution has, in recent years, come under the influence of a divisive, race centered ideology that promotes narratives that portray American and Western values as inherently harmful and oppressive. And here's the masterstroke. Trump put Vice President J.D. Vance, who sits on the Smithsonian Board of Regents, personally in charge of purging that improper ideology from every corner: the museums, the research centers, the education programs, and even the National Zoo. Vance is directed to recommend whatever additional actions are needed, and the order ties future funding to the condition that the Smithsonian stop dividing Americans by race and start celebrating the country that actually funds it. The order wasn't just words on paper. Follow up enforcement came fast and relentless. On August 12th, 2025, the White House sent a formal letter demanding a comprehensive internal review of 8 major Smithsonian museums, including the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Museum of American History, the National Museum of American Art, and the National Portrait Gallery. A second, even tougher follow up letter dropped in December 2025, and the message was crystal clear: get your exhibits in line with American exceptionalism or risk losing federal dollars. The administration is already tying appropriations to rules that prohibit funding for anything that degrades shared American values or pushes ideologies inconsistent with federal law. The impact? Curators who spent years turning museums into 1619 Project propaganda outlets are suddenly having to justify every panel, every label, and every interactive display. Exhibits that once framed America as irredeemably racist from day one are being quietly reworked to show the full story. The 89-year struggle that ended in evil every other civilization on Earth practiced for millennia. That's not erasure, that's honesty. And the left is calling it book burning because they know their narrative can't survive actual scrutiny. While the Smithsonian fight was happening behind the scenes, Trump went for the crown jewel of performing arts with both hands. In February 2025, he purged the Biden era board and installed 14 loyalists, including himself, Susie Wiles, Usha Vance, Laura Ingraham, and Maria Bartiromo. The new board immediately elected Trump as chairman and fired longtime President Deborah Rutter. They rewrote the bylaws so only presidential appointees can vote. Then they dissolved the entire Social Impact Division, which was the fancy name for the DEI propaganda arm. On December 18th, 2025, the board voted unanimously to rename the place the Donald J. Trump and the John F. Kennedy Memorial Center for the Performing Arts. And as you can imagine, and probably remember, CNN and The Guardian had meltdowns in real time. And just last month, February 1st, 2026, Trump announced the center will shut down entirely for 2 full years starting in July 2026 for a complete rebuilding and revitalization, timed perfectly with the 250th anniversary celebrations. No more taxpayer subsidized programming that treats children to drag shows while mocking everything that made this country great. Instead, we're getting the brightest stars who actually reflect American excellence. Some of the left's favorite artists are canceling left and right, screaming censorship while they walk away from millions in bookings. The irony is delicious as these are the same people, a part of the same crowd, who spent decades telling us government should control culture. Of course, that was until the government stopped promoting their version of it. Then there's the money, the lifeblood that kept the whole guilt industry breathing. In the fiscal year 2026 budget proposal released May 2025, Trump called for the complete elimination of the National Endowment for the Arts, NEA, the National Endowment for the Humanities, NEH, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS. Congress has blocked full elimination so far, keeping funding around $207 million each, but with heavy new strings attached. The old Challenge America grants that funneled money into underserved communities with heavy identity politics requirements have now been effectively labeled undeserved. New guidelines now prioritize projects that celebrate the 250th anniversary and American heritage. Anti DEI compliance rules are in place. Grants that once went to exhibits trashing Western civilization are being redirected or killed outright. Some grants were terminated midstream earlier this year, then partially reinstated after lawsuits. But the message is unmistakable. If you want federal money, you celebrate America. You don't apologize for it. These executive actions aren't revenge, they're restoration. For decades, leftist activists captured these institutions with our own tax dollars and turned them into weapons against the very civilization that built them. The Smithsonian didn't just mention slavery, it made it the central defining fact of American history while downplaying the Enlightenment miracle, the Christian moral awakening, and the blood soaked 89-year sprint that ended an evil humanity had accepted as normal for thousands of years. The Kennedy Center didn't just host art, it hosted ideological warfare against traditional values or historic truths. The NEA and NEH didn't fund truth, they funded division masquerading as beauty. These institutions exist to transmit the best of who we are, not to indoctrinate our children into hating their own country. They're supposed to inspire pride in the extraordinary progress of the American people, the same progress that abolished slavery faster and more decisively than any other major power in history. This is culturism in action. Some narratives are true, some are lies, and some cultures, ours, are objectively superior because they chose truth, liberty, and human flourishing over guilt, grievance, and endless self flagellation. But here's the deeper truth the left never wants you to hear, the one that makes their entire guilt factory project collapse under the weight of actual history. America didn't invent slavery. America ended it faster and at a greater moral cost than any society of its size and power in the entire recorded history of the human race. And the obsessive, laser focused obsession with those 89 years, while ignoring the thousands of years before and the pockets that still exist today, isn't education. It's psychological warfare against the greatest civilization ever built. Let's get this timeline straight, because facts still matter even when the left wishes they didn't. From the moment the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal in 1776 until the 13th Amendment was ratified on December 6, 1865, the United States as a sovereign nation existed with legal chattel slavery for exactly 89 years. 89. That's it. A single lifetime. And we paid for ending it with over 700,000 American dead in the bloodiest war in our history. More Americans than died in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. No gradual compensated emancipation like in Britain, no quiet fade out. We tore ourselves apart because a young republic founded on Enlightenment reason and Christian moral conviction decided that this ancient evil had to die, right now, no matter the cost. Now, let's compare that to the rest of human history and watch the left's narrative evaporate. Korea, the longest unbroken chain of slavery in recorded history, practiced it for over 2,000 years from antiquity straight through the Joseon dynasty until final legal abolition in 1894. At its peak, slaves made up 30 to 40% of the entire population, sometimes higher. Hereditary, codified, generational, for 2 millennia. No civil war ended it, no moral awakening, just centuries of normalized human ownership. The Islamic Arab slave trade? 1,300 continuous years, starting in the 7th century and running well into the 20th. Conservative scholarly estimates put the number of Africans enslaved at 10 to 18 million through the trans Saharan and Indian Ocean routes alone. That's more than the entire transatlantic trade, stretched across more than a millennium. Women and girls were taken 3 to 1 for sexual exploitation and harems. Castrated boys died by the tens of thousands. And it didn't end because of some Islamic enlightenment. It faded when Western pressure and economics finally made it untenable. Mauritania didn't criminalize slavery until 1981. Saudi Arabia kept it legal into the 1960s, and pockets still exist in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa today. Babylon, Egypt, China, the Ottoman Empire, pre colonial African kingdoms, India's caste system, the Mongols, every major civilization on Earth treated slavery as the default setting of human society for thousands of years. It was the norm, not the exception. Subjugation was how empires were built. Indentured servitude and hereditary bondage were status quo. And yet, here comes this upstart republic, 89 measly years. And it doesn't just phase slavery out, it rips it out by the roots at the price of its own blood because the principles in the Declaration and the moral fire of Christian abolitionists demanded it. No other nation of comparable size, power, and global influence has ever done anything like it. Not one. Britain abolished its empire's slavery gradually and compensated the owners. Haiti did it through a violent revolt on a tiny island. Most others waited until industrialization replaced free human labor. America did it purely on moral conviction, Enlightenment natural rights, and the radical Christian idea that every human soul is made in the image of God. That is the remarkable feat. That is the part that should make every American stand a little taller. But instead, what do we get from the left? The 1619 Project. Smithsonian exhibits that frame 1619 as the true founding. Kennedy Center programming and NEA grants that teach our kids America was born in sin and has never escaped it. They pick at that 189-year scab that they have embellished into a 157-year scab like it's the only thing that ever happened here. They ignore the extraordinary progress that followed, the defeat of fascism, the defeat of communism, the moon landing, the invention of the modern world, the lifting of billions out of poverty through the very Western values they mock. It's exactly like that salesman who walks into a boardroom and delivers the perfect pitch with flawless delivery. He secures millions in investments, saves the company, gets the promotion, bonus big enough to take his wife on the vacation of a lifetime. But during the pitch, he mispronounces one little word, just one inconsequential syllable. And that night, when his wife asks how his day went, he doesn't talk about the triumph. He doesn't talk about the investors writing checks. He doesn't talk about saving the firm or the raise or the future he just secured. He sits there defeated and says, I messed up the E in one word. How ridiculous. How self defeating. How utterly pathetic. And yet, that's exactly what the modern left has done to America. They've taken the greatest success story in human history, a civilization that ended the universal evil of slavery faster and more decisively than anyone else, while also building unmatched liberty and prosperity, and reduced it to that one mispronounced syllable. They don't want you thinking about the abolitionists, the Union dead, the constitutional miracle, or the 250 years of relentless progress that followed. They want you fixated on the flaw so you'll never notice the masterpiece. And the crowning irony? While they obsess over America's ended slavery, modern slavery is still thriving in the very non Western cultures they romanticize. The latest global slavery index shows 50 million people in modern slavery worldwide right now, with the highest prevalence in the Arab states in Africa: Turkey, Eritrea, Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, Sudan. Places where the left tells us to respect cultural differences still have descent based slavery and forced labor on a scale that makes 19th century America look quaint. But you won't hear a word about that from the same people screaming that a museum exhibit celebrating American greatness is erasure. This is why President Trump's reclamation of the Smithsonian, the Kennedy Center, and public arts funding isn't some partisan stunt. It's a moral correction. It's saying, enough with the scab picking, enough with turning our national treasures into temples of self hatred. These institutions exist to pass down the truth that America took on an evil baked into human nature for millennia and crushed it in 89 years at the cost of its own blood because our principles demanded it. They exist to inspire the next generation with the extraordinary achievements of the American people, not to indoctrinate them into hating the only civilization that ever chose to end an evil so decisively. The left calls this censorship. We call it sanity. Because a nation that spends all its time staring at its one flaw while ignoring its unmatched triumph isn't wise, it's suicidal, and we are not going to let them finish the job. The history of America is one of grit, determination, moral clarity, and bloodshed in the pursuit of furthering human rights for its citizens. While no society can exist without its sins, just as no individual who makes up a society can, it is of the gravest injustice to overlook an overwhelming good in favor of small evils for the sake of self hatred and expedient elimination. If you've made it this far, I thank you for your time and hope there was at least one thing that was cause for reflection. Please like and subscribe as I will be posting regularly to draw attention to the vitally important cultural battles fought every day for the soul of this country. Little by little, we will reverse this cancerous post American culture that has been bought and paid for by the enemies of America by dragging the lies into the sunlight and resurrecting the truthful narrative on its decomposing corpse. Until next time, God bless.